So in today's video, we're going to take a look at an important aspect of choosing stocks, trying to decide whether they're cheap or expensive, and that's technical analysis. Now, some people dismiss this as mumbo jumbo, little better than reading tea leaves. However, fund manager Anthony Bolton, hugely successful, thinks, amongst others, that it has a role in every investor's toolkit. So, what is technical analysis, and what are the sort of key things that people try to get from it? We won't do anything more than an introduction in this video. We clearly couldn't in the time available, but we'll talk about what it is, when it's used, and one or two of the key tools that technical analysis makes use of, also known as charting. Okay, so how many ways are there to analyse a stock? Fundamentally, there are two. Basically, you can do what's called fundamental analysis. Or you can do this, which is technical. Also known as charting. Now, there's two schools of thought. So the die-hard fanatics, if you like, in either camp, over here say this is nonsense. Because basically the only way of deciding whether a stock is cheap or expensive, or whether the whole market is cheap or expensive, or whether a house is cheap or expensive, or a currency, or copper, or gold, is roll your sleeves up, do it bottom up. In stock picking terms, that means get a hold of the accounts, do some ratio analysis, build a picture of whether you think the stock is currently cheap or expensive in relation to what you expect. In other words, you are challenging the market's view, because you're effectively saying the market's wrong, this stock has been overlooked, it's a bargain. And I know that because I've done my homework on it. Chartists, on the other hand, say, well, that's nonsense, or at least it's not the full picture, because, frankly, it doesn't matter what you think. What really matters is what the market thinks, and the market is never wrong. In other words, technical analysis is built on the work of people like Charles Dow, and Dow, essentially, all his work can be distilled into three key points. Number one, everything that's known about a stock is in the price already. So you, Tim Bennett, are not going to just uncover something that everyone else doesn't already know. So don't waste your time trying. Number two, the market is always right, in the sense that anything that should be known about a stock, either now or going into the future, has been discounted into the price. And the price, therefore, already contains all the information that's relevant to deciding whether to buy or sell that stock. And thirdly, when matters more than why. Okay, and basically what that's saying is, it doesn't matter what your view of a stock is in one sense, all you need to spot is what's happening to it. Is it trending up? Is it trending down? Spot the trend early enough and climb on board. In other words, the trend is your friend. Or as Keynes once put it, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And what he meant by that, if you like, is anyone who sat through the last housing boom saying houses are too expensive, fundamentally they're too expensive, waited a long time to be proved right. They were proved right eventually, but it took a long time. I sold a house expecting the market to collapse about 6 years before it did. So eventually I was right, but in the long run we're all dead, as the quote goes. So technical analysis says, basically get good at spotting trends, herd behaviour, and climb on board as early as you can. And that's basically where charting comes in, because charting is all about saying, well, the past is a guide to the future. Forget that warning you see sometimes on adverts. You can decide what to do next by looking at what's just happened. Now, the truth of the matter is, you probably need a mixture of the two. Anthony Bolton, the fund manager I mentioned earlier, likes fundamental analysis supplemented with technical analysis. So in other words, you need to understand whether you think fundamentally a stock or a market is good value, but then use this to get your timing right. And if you're into spread betting, very, very short-term trading, technical analysis, there I am back again, technical analysis is basically fairly essential, because if you're spread betting minute to minute, you don't have time necessarily to do all this stuff. What you want to do is jump in and out of the market over fairly short time periods. So there is a case to be made for saying technical analysis tends to get more heavily used short-term trading rather than long-term investing. In other words, if you're a spread better, you might use this quite heavily, and this not very much. If you're a long-term buy and hold investor, odds are, I'd say, you're going to use this a lot and that a little bit. Okay, but you'll find the argument on both sides. Some people 100% here, none here, and vice versa. Okay, so what are the key tools of a chartist? Now, we can only do a few today, but what does it mean? I look at past movements and try and predict the future. How do I use a chart? Well, a chart is essentially quite simple in one respect. I mean, a chart can literally be two axes like that. So there's time and there's price. And one way to look at prices over time is on a graph, and you could simply look at individual prices over time. So for example, I could take the closing price of Tesco or the closing price of the S&P 500 and plot it. So I could sort of do this type of thing, put a line through it, and there's a graph. And that says the trend is upward. So if you are a chartist, very, very, very simple conclusion, you might say, I can expect the trend to keep going. In other words, it can take a long time for an uptrend to reverse, it can take a long time for a downtrend to reverse. And that's the idea, remember, we're deciding, should I buy a stock? And chartists are saying, hop on board when there's a rising trend. Ideally, get in here, but better to get in there than miss out altogether. Of course, the danger is, if you get in here and that happens, a bit of a bad decision. But nonetheless, charting is built on two things. Number one, spotting that uptrend, and of course number two, a chartist would claim to know roughly when that's going to happen. That's also pretty important. So a chartist will say, I'll get out before everything goes pear-shaped. Whether they're right or not, of course, depends on when exactly they choose to get out of the market. And of course, people are very good at justifying what they did 5 minutes ago. So sometimes it's hard to tell whether someone got out because they were lucky or because the charts actually told them to. Anyway, that's very simple. That's a single line. And the problem with a single line based on individual prices is volatility can distort the pattern. So what a lot of chartists like to do is use something called a moving average. So rather than just plot single prices over time, if they're looking at the S&P 500 for a hint as to where it's going to go next, they use moving averages. So a moving average, what is that? Well, a moving average would say, actually, what we're going to do, I'll do a little 5-day moving average. Normally you do a 50-day or a 200-day. In fact, those two are very commonly used together in the market for indices. So a 5-day moving average would say, well, actually, if I've got 5 prices, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, you might say, well, that's not very volatile. So that, I could use any of those and my trend would probably look the way it should. But a moving average would say, well, actually, there's 5 prices. So a 5-day moving average would add all of those up, and that comes to 70. Divide by 5, and get 14. So a simple average. Add those up, divide by 5, 14. So you'd plot 14. Now, it's a moving average. So the point is, tomorrow there'll be a new price. This is day 6, there'll be a new price. So imagine the price goes up to 20 tomorrow. If I'm doing a 5-day moving average, rather than average those, I now average those. So I bring in the last price and knock off the first one. And if you do that, add up 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that the moving average is now 16. So in other words, I'm ignoring the extremes and going for literally the average and watching how it changes over time. So a 50-day moving average would obviously need 50 prices, a 200-day, 200 and so on. Now, you might think, what's the point of that? Well, imagine I make these prices a bit more extreme. So for example, imagine my 5 prices are 1, 14, 16, 18, and then 31. Okay, so the outliers are a bit more extreme now, a bit further away. The point about a moving average, if you add those up and divide by 5, you still get 16. So the point is to try and take out the distorting effects of one-off jumps in, say, a share price or an index. Now, how can that be used? So far it's just number crunching. And the answer is the golden cross and the death cross. Very dramatic sounding. Chartists like to do this kind of thing. They want to know when the S&P 500 is going to turn up or down. So maybe you've got something like this. Let's say you've got a 200-day moving average on the S&P 500 doing that, and the 50-day doing that. Okay, that indicates potentially the market is about to head steeply south. In other words, the short-term moving average cutting down through the longer-term moving average suggests people are getting more and more bearish in their outlook, and that is sometimes known as a death cross for that reason. It's a sign the S&P might be about to start heading south quite sharply. The golden cross is the opposite way around. So maybe the S&P 500 has been heading down based on its 200-day moving average. So that's quite a long, medium long-term picture, 2/3 of a year or whatever it is. So maybe the 200-day has been doing this, probably not a straight line, and the 50 suddenly does that. So maybe the 50 was going with it, and suddenly it pulls up. That, if that trend continues, is going to pull the 200 with it at some point. So it's a sign that the market might be about to turn up. So there's one quick tool that analysts like to use. And if you've got volume supporting that, so in other words, if not only have you got this happening, but suddenly the volume of trades being placed short term is rising, that can also suggest that there's confidence behind this new trend. The market's turning and more people are buying the turn in the market. Whereas if you get 50-day and 200-day moving averages supported by low volume, you could say, well, it's hard to tell really whether enough people believe this changing trend. Okay, one more tool of the chartist, quite important to be aware of, the candlestick. So another way that chartists will try and spot a turn in the market, and then you've got sort of two key tools, is the candlesticks. In other words, on a graph, plotting a single point, let's say the closing price each day, is considered to be limited information. So another way of plotting a point on a graph is a bar or a candlestick. Now a bar would show the closing price as a line, and then basically the high and the low price for the security at the top and the bottom. So in other words, the day's high, the day's low, and where the price closed. And that shows a little bit more information. And again, a bull would say, well, if the closing price keeps pushing up towards the high price for the day, that is a bullish indicator. Or if you're a bull trader and the closing price keeps pulling down towards the lowest price for the day, maybe the bears are taking over. You can go a step further, make it into a candlestick. So, candlesticks look more like that. There's the high, there's the low for the day, there's the open, and there's the close. So, different points, because that's the lowest price seen over the day, could be any time, whereas that's the price at the start of the day and that's the price at the end of the day. And often you'll see these are left white or blue. If that happens, generally bullish. Black or red, bearish. And again, candlesticks can give you a lot more information than a single point on the graph, and gives chartists the ability to start to read what the market might be about to do next. So, very quick summary there of why charting exists, what moving averages add to the picture, and how you can improve a single point graph using a candlestick. A lot more information on the Money Week website.